let's talk about the biggest issues that New World need to solve right now. And I think in recent months that New World and Amazon have done quite a lot of little things that have improved the game pretty dramatically. And I now think that we have a decent solid MMO. And that leads me to my first issue, which is I think public perception of the game is, well, it's quite bad. People will say that the game is dead. People will say that the dupes and the exploits ruin the game. Some people will say that it's overly grindy and, you know, more. Quite frankly, a lot of these things have changed over time. And pretty much the game is now suffering from its past reputation without current merit. Obviously, in the past, that reputation was pretty much justified to some extent, but now it's like a hangover of the issues. I did a recent video talking about why I think now is a good time for players to start coming back, because basically if you were annoyed at little things like the cost of Azov travel and storage, well, a lot of those issues have been resolved and I think you'll have a happier time playing the game. Now, the reputation of the game will improve if the game continues to do well with its players. If the players are happy, they'll start spreading the word, essentially like I am doing now. And over time, the reputation that it had will fade. A little bit like how people still talk about Final Fantasy XIV start. But we can live with it as long as the game eventually becomes good, and it's getting there. Issue number 2 is dead servers. What's happening is that people are coming back to the game, they're logging on, and they're logging on to find their character in a dead server. Now, these players might not realize that they probably have a transfer token, so they just look at the game, conclude that the game is dead, and then leave. Because if you log onto the game and there's an empty Tyrant and there's an empty chat, it's going to feel pretty bad. And weirdly, it really doesn't need to be like this. There's quite a few servers with very healthy populations. If they logged on and they were on one of those, they would feel a lot happier. However, there are people who are literally stuck on dead servers because maybe they've used both their transfer tokens and then people have left that server and now they're left being like, oh, well, there's nothing I can do. At least in the short term, because this is going to be solved in a couple of ways. One of them is going to be paid transfers. So I don't know for the price exactly, but I would guess that most people might be able to afford it. Obviously, if you can't afford it, then you might be a little bit out of luck and I would feel bad for you. But you're going to be able to spend your money if you're stuck on a server and transfer it off. That doesn't help the players who don't realize that they can do that, who just log on and then log off, but it'll help the players who are stuck. And there's also going to be at some point cross-realm play, which will mean the issues that you face on being a dead server will be a lot lessened. However, I still think that they should do something with these dead servers, either merge them all together or merge a smaller server with a bigger server. Now, the argument against doing that is if all the players start coming back all at once, then you're going to end up with queues and that people aren't going to like that. But personally, I always say we should just worry about that if it ever gets to that point. For me, they need to merge and they need to merge quickly. Issue number 3 is time gating. Well, actually, I've started to think that this issue may be mostly overstated. Sure, it's definitely still in the game, but I think its effects are a lot less intrusive at this point. So firstly, well, expedition orbs are so freely and readily available that it's not really a time gate anymore. You can very easily either just buy your own keys so that you can run with your friends, or you can buy slots in people's groups for pretty much like cost value. It's very easy to run multiple a day, even for a casual player. And then really the next biggest issue when it comes to time gating is the expertise and the gypsum cast. So for the gypsum, getting the gypsum itself is limited to once per day per activity, but basically for the raw gypsum itself, you're going to get 1 gypsum orb's worth of gypsum per day potentially. And then crafting these specific casts themselves, so like the blunderbuss or the great axe or whatever, that's also once per day. Actually creating the orbs is not limited to once per day, because the theory there is if you just miss a day, they don't want you to be like left behind. Now, I'm a little bit torn on this issue, because essentially the system of these gypsum orbs and stuff like that is to try and get you to do more than one type of content. Like they want you to do a dungeon, but they also want you to do Outpost Rush, rather than say just farm dungeons all day. And really, to me, the gypsum sort of feels like it's supposed to be a supplementary system rather than the core way of getting up your expertise, especially if you're leveling from gear score 500 to 600, because the content itself feels like it gives a decent amount of expertise upgrades. You know, the expeditions are good, Outpost Rush chests are alright, they've got a little bit better over time. So I don't necessarily think this time gating is terrible. I would say that they could loosen it, I think, either by allowing more of the gypsum to be obtained per day so that you can then create multiple orbs per day. And a bit of me thinks they could do that because, quite frankly, maybe I have more time at the weekend than I do in the weekday. Why would you then stop me like progressing as much on the weekend? Sort of let me power through the content if I have the time to do so. So you could get more raw gypsum per day, or you could indeed allow multiple casts per day so that if somebody who, like myself, is pretty much gear score 600 or above, for the blunderbuss, I have to basically just grind out the expertise on the blunderbuss. Now, the main way I'm going to do that is pretty much through the casts, because doing dungeons is a little bit unreliable when you're after just one piece. So overall, I don't really think that the time gating is that big of an issue anymore, because you can more easily farm content now. Like, the dungeon orbs are so readily available that you can farm them on repeat if you want to. Outpost Rush, for example, is free, and that will probably get you some expertise bumps as well. If you see Gypsum as a supplement, then it's not that bad. And we have to consider that the orbs at some point are going to get removed. Well, they're not actually getting removed. What is going to happen is that the dungeons are going to be free to enter, and then the orbs are very likely just going to boost the quality of gear that you find. And that will please a lot of people. Number 4, we're going to be talking about Endgame. Now, the Endgame is so much better than what it used to be. We now actually have dungeon progression. You know, we have Laz Gen, then you can go into Tempest's Heart, then you can go into Mutations. Like, there's actually a path you can follow by just doing dungeons. I still think when it comes to the mutations that gear scaling is pretty dumb. I really still don't like it, but I can live with it. But really, if you want PvE content, then it is a little bit limited and a little bit shallow. Now, for PvE, they have turned off player collision, and I'm presuming that's to enable something like raids in the future. But that's unlikely to happen this year because we've already seen the roadmap, and sure, we're going to get 2 new expeditions, but there's no indication of like raid content or essentially harder PvE content beyond mutations. One thing that's going to help the casual players is that there's going to be a group finder, and that's just going to help overall with people accessing the end game. But yeah, there's a lot of people who have pretty much almost like finished all of the end game. You know, they're doing M10s, they've already done the new dungeon, and then they don't really have much PvE to do. And when it comes to PvP, well, there's still not that much PvP progression, and when it comes to crafting, well, there's not that much crafting progression. It's basically gambling, and we'll come on to that in a minute. With PvP, we have one battleground with Outpost Rush. Wars can be relatively hard to get into depending on your server, and let's face it, the PvP missions are pretty boring. But we do know that PvP arenas are coming, and I think for a lot of people that will solve the endgame PvP issues. That will just feel nice for so many people that they'll be happy, and there are going to be some kind of reward with that, and I'm not really sure what we'll see with that, but it sounds interesting. But yeah, as I said, there's only one battleground map basically, and the PvP quests are boring, so yeah, there's a little bit lack of content for PvPers. And quite frankly, there's not really many reasons to flag up in the open world, and hopefully they're going to be working on something to introduce more fun skirmish based PvP in the open world. Overall, I would say that the end game is okay, just a little bit shallow. Number 5, we're going to be talking about wealth inequality and the crafting randomness. Now, I always talk about these pretty much every opportunity I get. I talk about these, and I'm going to continue to talk about these because I still think it's a big problem, and I think it's just a frustration for a lot of players who aren't really the top end players. And the point is that the owners of Everfall, Windswood, etc. are way too rich. Essentially, you're taking money away from the little guys and giving it to the big guy. You're giving money from the casuals to the hardcore players, and it just feels wrong to me. Now, of course, yes, the owners of these towns should be rewarded. I just think that the reward is far too big. You know, there's companies getting literally like 1 to 3 million gold every week. And obviously, I keep going on about that crafting being far too random, and let's face it, it literally is gambling. Sure, when you hit this item, it feels great, it feels nice, etc. But most of the time, that's not what you get. I just don't really feel like this gambling mechanic is really all that good for the game. It feels mostly frustrating. It's way too random. And yes, I appreciate again that if you want the best rewards, it shouldn't be very easy to get. But what happens if you literally just bumped up the amount of materials to craft the items and you would guarantee a better item? Imagine if everything cost 10 times as more, so 10 times more Asmodeum, etc. Well, would it be all that bad if you then had like, you could guarantee maybe 2 perks or 3 perks or whatever? I don't know. I'm not the designer, but the crafting right now is way too random for me. And basically that randomness allows those big companies to be way ahead of everybody because they have so much gold that they can just throw the money at gambling, and it's not really a big loss for them. And I just think overall this system is creating a community of the haves and the have-nots, and I really think it needs addressing sooner rather than later, but there's nothing on the horizon, and I worry it's because they don't want to annoy the hardcore players who are the owners of Everfall and Windswood. But quite frankly, there's probably more people who casually play the game than the 100 players who hardcore defend these towns. So basically, I just dislike both. I dislike the wealth inequality and I dislike the gambling randomness. And I think if you solve both of those, a lot of the community would be happier. So they're the biggest issues that I have with New World right now. As I said during this, a lot of them are actually being addressed, and I think ultimately the game will solve most of these problems. But as they say, time waits for no man or Amazon. They just need to essentially address these these bigger, wider problems with the game's design, and I think we'll be in a better place. There's a couple of things that I didn't mention. For example, I didn't mention how I did a video talking about how I don't like the loot. I think the loot is formulaic and boring, but I don't necessarily think it's causing a massive issue right now. I also think that casuals, beyond just the companies getting an insane amount of gold, get a little bit shafted. There's probably not enough solo play that you can do in the open world that actually feels like it's progressing your character. There's a couple of things I would like to see addressed, but I just don't think they're very big for most of the players right now, but they are still issues. However, do let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Did I hit the ones that you think are big issues? Did I not? If I didn't, let me know in the comments. Have a most beautiful day. Like, subscribe, come follow me on Twitch. Goodbye.